By this point, you should have done a little bit about thinking about how you write a plan and what a plan is, what the affirmative is, and what the negative is. And so the question is, you're going to be debating affirmative half the time. So what do you want to talk about during that half of the time? In this video, we're going to talk about how to establish what kind of case that you want to read when you're on the affirmative, which you do half the time, how to find the evidence for that, and also how to manage as far as a team dynamic goes. Do you all want to read the exact same affirmative, or do you want to read different affirmatives so that there's a lot of diversity? Hopefully by the end of this video, we'll be able to answer some of those questions for you. Now, the main thing that we want to talk about when thinking about what kind of affirmative you want to read is this. You're going to be talking about this idea or this plan half of your rounds. So if you go to 8 tournaments in a year and you debate 4 rounds at every tournament, you're going to be making this argument for 16 rounds. That's a lot of time that you're going to be focusing in on what a specific segment of the topic is about. So make sure that it's something that you're at least interested in, or that you can make yourself interested enough in it if it's a really strategically interesting affirmative. This, by the way, doesn't mean that it has to be like your life calling or the thing that you're the most interested in of all time. Realistically, my senior year in high school, my affirmative that I read all year was about hydroelectric power. Now, I enjoy reading about it. I thought it was interesting, but honestly, is talking about hydroelectricity something that really gets me going? Not so much. With that said, since you are going to have to be debating it half the time, what do you start looking for? How do you start figuring out, like out of all of the things that we could talk about on this topic, what do I want to talk about? One of the things that I would suggest to do to start with is start doing some research. A good way to do this is to start by looking for articles that are written that say things like the United States federal government should, and then something about the topic, or Congress should. Look for people who advocate a specific course of action to try to solve some of the problem that is inherent in the topic. When you start looking for authors and then write your cases based on what those authors say, a lot of times they're also going to be very scholarly papers. They're going to have footnotes and other articles that you can research, so that you're going to be able to really build out an affirmative case that is grounded in the literature base. This is really important because it means that your evidence is going to probably be superior to a lot of other people who are just reading staff writers and other people in that aren't really academic writings. Once you start looking at that, then though, you can start sorting out, okay, there's a lot of different people who say the government should do something, but what do I want to talk about? I really think that after you find what the authors are talking about, there's kind of 2 categories of types of affirmatives that you can go toward. One is called the big stick, and one is called a squirrel case. And granted, these are not like it's 100% one or the other. There's some gray area in between. But the truth is, there is a huge difference between how these 2 types of affirmatives work. On the big stick affirmative, what you're looking for is something that is like the most common, most down the line type of argument that you can find. Realistically, these authors are probably the most qualified. This is probably the thing that has been written about the most. And honestly, like if you were just to ask a person who doesn't know about debate what this topic probably means, the big stick affirmative is likely to be one of the things that they're going to talk about. There are some benefits to doing this. For example, the research is probably easier. It's probably easier to explain this, especially to judges who aren't necessarily trained in debate. And you're likely to be able to find impacts to your affirmative that will outweigh the disadvantages. Like it's probably just a good idea to do your plan. The disadvantage to doing a big stick affirmative is that everyone's going to be prepared for it. So when you go into a tournament, you know that everyone else who is going to be debating you has already thought about your affirmative. You're not going to trick them. So it really comes down to, do you think that you're better off explaining your affirmative and not having to worry about topicality than you are not doing that? On the other hand, there's kind of this squirrel case idea which is a little tiny case that maybe there's like one or two small articles about. They don't really come to front of mind when you're talking about the topic, but there's something that's been written about it, and we can kind of play around in that space. Honestly, most of the time, the links between your evidence that says you should do the plan and the advantages that you're going to claim are probably not as strong as with the big sticks because they're not written about as much. But the advantage is that your opponents aren't really going to be prepared to debate against this. So if you debate within a squirrel case half the time, honestly, your opponents aren't even talking about it a tenth of the time. So you get a lot of advantage because you're much more familiar with talking about it. One of the disadvantages is that sometimes, especially if your judges aren't very familiar with the topic, they might think that what you're doing isn't really the core of what they should be listening to. So they might have questions that about whether or not it's topical. And topicality is one of those things that it's really hard to explain to a judge who doesn't know a whole lot about debate. It's pretty intuitive. Look, like nobody knows about this. And so there's a lot bigger burden that you really have to overcome with an affirmative that's kind of squirrely. The other thing that you should be thinking about when you're trying to decide what kind of an affirmative case you want to write is, do you want to write one by yourself, or does your whole team want to do one together? One of the advantages about writing one for yourself is that you can have more practice debates. You can debate a lot of different sides, so you can get better on the negative and you can get better on the affirmative. And it also helps it such that when you're debating another team, they're not saying things like, well, there's the school, we know exactly what they're going to read, and so we can just prepare against one thing. However, a lot of times there's a lot of benefit to also writing one affirmative as an entire team or an entire squad. First of all, you're going to have a lot more people looking for that evidence, which means you find the best evidence on that plan, not just some evidence on that plan. The second thing is, as the season progresses, you're going to hear more and more arguments against your plan, which means that you can prepare out. You have more hands on deck, and you're not trying to scatter yourself all over the place. Realistically, there's not a correct answer to if you share the same affirmative as a squad, or if everybody reads their own, or if there's some permutation between the two of them. But the truth is that when you're deciding what affirmative you want to read, you and your partner, or you and your squad, need to come up with an answer to this that makes the most sense for you, because you're going to be affirmative half the time. So you should be amazing on the affirmative. With that said, if you have any questions, make sure you subscribe or look at our next video. Thanks so much.